very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to see a full house here. As has been mentioned by both Schengen and Keith, IFPRI has contributed input to the SOFA 2012 on investment in agriculture. So what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing at least some key highlights of the two background studies that have been undertaken to contribute to the SOFA. And while the SOFA 2012 focuses on agricultural investments as a whole, like was mentioned, this discussion here in the work in IFPRI has been more on the public investment side. So we'll be talking about that. So the outline really is a very simple graph that I'll be using in lieu of sort of a long list of what we'll be talking about, since we only have 10 minutes in any case. The key two questions that I want to discuss is, number one, what has been the contribution of public investments in and for agriculture, for agricultural growth and productivity, for poverty reduction and other goals? And the second question is, what actually drives public investments in agriculture? So I'll start with the first one mentioned last. So that's the right-hand side of the graph. So as a first question, we want to discuss what types of investments tend to have the greatest returns. We have seen already a little bit of a sneak preview on that issue. And I will be exemplifying this, the findings on the case of 4 country studies in China, India, Thailand, and Uganda. This is work that has been done in IFPRI. I should probably preface to mention that the background studies that underlie this presentation are really a comprehensive review of the academic literature on the impacts of public investments in and for agriculture. So we look at both IFPRI research as well as non-IFPRI research. So I'll just be highlighting a few examples here, predominantly from IFPRI research. So what we see here, one of the striking results that emerge from these case studies as well as others, is that agricultural research and development investments have consistently shown to be the highest, to have the highest impact on agricultural productivity. So when what you see here, maybe I should quickly explain, are a graphical representation. A graphical representation of econometric results on the question of alternative investments and their returns. So the graphs essentially show dollar for dollar or monetary unit for monetary unit impacts of alternative investments, in this case for agricultural productivity. So as you can see, comparing across the different country case studies, agricultural research and development has by far outpaced other types of investments in leading to greater agricultural productivity. Now, what you also see, and I hope it's visible from here, is that that is not necessarily the case for all types of agricultural investments. So one example is irrigation, that you see represented in at least 3 of the 4 case studies. It is not necessarily the highest contributor other than ag R&D for agricultural productivity. So, for example, in China, the second largest type of spending impact is from education in rural areas, and after that roads, and only much later you have irrigation spending as having kind of a contribution. Still positive, but certainly not the highest. So we have some more recent results on African countries, which essentially reflect that other than agriculture, in terms of the other sectors, you see that there's a diversity across countries in terms of the relative returns. One thing that we also found in my work in Ethiopia is when you actually look at aggregate spending in agriculture, as opposed to focusing on ag research or extension or certain high productive areas, you don't necessarily find the case that agricultural aggregate spending will have the highest returns. This kind of reflects a little bit what we saw in the earlier graphs. And this has also been quite consistent with more cross-country case study findings. So maybe I should again explain. The numbers you see here are essentially just rankings. So in Ghana, for example, agriculture has had the highest returns. That's number 1. lowest from at least the four is education, so forth. Now, when we look at a different type of outcome, not agricultural productivity, but poverty reduction, what's emerging here and what's quite interesting is that despite often the stated sort of trade-off between achieving goals in growth versus achieving the goals of poverty reduction, in agricultural research, you find that again, ag research contributes quite highly, not necessarily the highest, but certainly the second highest in most country cases, to reducing poverty. With regard to the other types of investments, you have some variation, but again, you have sort of a consistent story here on agricultural research. Now, it's important to realize that investments don't have the same impacts over time. Over time, these effects can vary and can change. I'm going to exemplify that using this case study of India, where a study has looked at the contributions of credit subsidies, power subsidies, and other types of subsidy spending, and public goods spending. And what we see is that at the time of the Green Revolution, even though there is sort of diversity in terms of the different impacts of different kinds of subsidies and different kinds of public goods spending, they're kind of commensurate. You have high impact credit subsidies, you have high impact R&D, and you may have some lower impact, both subsidies and public goods spending. But as you sort of progress to the 80s and 90s, past the early stages of the Green Revolution, these impacts and the relative impacts change over time. So subsidies certainly start falling far behind in terms of what they contribute to agricultural growth and agricultural productivity compared to public goods spending. And it's quite important to be aware of these over time changes. Now, similar to the impacts over time, you have impacts over space that differ. And I'll exemplify that using graphs again. So here you have, again, 3-country case study, India, China, and Uganda, where the studies were able to disaggregate the effects for high potential areas and low potential areas, and areas that are sort of in the middle within countries. So the green bars reflect the impacts of different types of expenditures, as you see, high-yielding variety investments, roads, irrigation, and so forth, in the more high-impact areas. And yellow and brown reflect lower impact, lower potential areas. So, for example, rain-fed areas, or in China, the western regions. And interestingly, counter to conventional wisdom, what we see here is that the so-called low potential areas, at least on the margin, investments in these areas can actually have higher impacts, not only in terms of poverty reduction, what you may expect given that in these areas you have poorer populations, but also in agricultural performance. Okay, so I'm going to pivot now to the second question, namely what drives public investments in agriculture and for agriculture. And the reason it's actually important to even ask this question is that there's the phenomenon that certain types of spending that have been shown through a wide body of work to have unambiguously high effects, part of what we discussed earlier, have actually been heavily underinvested, and ag R&D is a good example. And vice versa, low impact expenditures have been given high budget attention. So I'll go over this very quickly, given the time. Essentially, what we did is we organized the body of work, the research that investigates this question, into 4 areas: the budget process, different actors and their incentives, characteristics of agricultural investment, and I'll explain all of this, and the overall political and economic governance environment, and how all of these bear on public expenditure decision-making in agriculture. In terms of processes for budgetary decision-making, it's important to realize that the formal procedures of planning and budgeting and so forth may have, of course, a role to play in what decisions are made, but there are very clearly informal and de facto processes at work, And this is not only a phenomenon, as we know, in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So it's important to be cognizant of these informal procedures. Generally, there are a range of models and empirical investigations of how the budget process bears on public investments. So some models suggest that processes are actually quite random in actuality, and it's hard to predict what these processes are on the one extreme. And on the other extreme, they suggest that there are incremental approaches. So today's budget allocations will look like yesterday's or like last year's, with some increases by some percentage. The truth lies somewhere in between. And I'll just sort of stop at that, even though there's much more to say about how the budget processes actually work. One last point on processes is that the impact on actual expenditures, to investigate that, you have to actually go beyond the planning and budget process to see how budgets actually translate into expenditures. And there's some striking results that have been found through public expenditure tracking surveys that look at this question. As far as actors in public investment decision-making, really, again, a lot can be said on that. But generally, to just point out that the standard economics literature suggests that, at least implicitly, that there's sort of a social planner that is unencumbered, makes autonomous decisions, and maximizes some social welfare functions. The reality, however, is much more complicated and murky, again, across developing and developed countries. So it's quite important to understand what the incentives, the forces, and the constraints are of different public decision makers, the way economics investigates the incentives of producers and consumers in the private area. I'll just move on because of short time. Characteristics of publicly provided goods and services can actually influence how, to what extent they get budget attention. So for example, whether or not a public good or a publicly provided good is easily attributable to the policymakers that are making this decision will influence whether or not they're going to be spent on. So, for example, a building or vouchers and subsidies where you can kind of label or mark that the policymaker has been responsible for this funding will make it more attractive for that kind of investment. The more invisible types of investments that may be just as valuable or more valuable may be underinvested in. Okay, so just to very quickly summarize, on the impacts of public investments, a key policy consideration should realize that there's really compelling evidence, much more than we had time to cover today, on the high social returns to public investments in agricultural research and technology. Policymakers should also choose judiciously between different agricultural subsectors and functions, because not all types of agricultural spending is equal in terms of its contribution. And the time dimensions of public investment effects should be taken into account, as the space dimension. On the determinants of public investments, it's useful to think about, is there a value to the incrementalism models? Do they reflect reality? And some evidence suggests yes. And that would suggest that it's important to identify what could break the inertia that underlies this incrementalist budget allocation model. So, also, the so-called unencumbered social planner model or thinking should be revisited, and I think in reality should even be dispensed with, because that does not reflect how resources are allocated, what forces public decision makers face. And finally, I think a much better understanding is needed in agriculture on how this visibility of investments, the attributability of investments, bears on the likelihood that these investments will be undertaken. Okay, thank you very much.